Thanks very much for tuning in. If you are just tuning in, it's the 27th of April, and this time, 25 years ago, millions of South Africans went to the polls and voted for the first time, particularly black South Africans who had never experienced a democratic society, and many lives were lost for decades during the apartheid era and even periods before, just so that you can have the basic right of being able to vote. And this happened on the 27th of April, 1994. And a lot of people, we had a lot of excitement, anticipation about a future that was going to play out and that was hoped for by people over generations. Helping us to unpack some of that day and the years that have followed, I'm now joined by a senior researcher at the Trade Collective, Lebohang Pheko. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. Always good to have you. And I just wonder, 25 years on, cast your mind back to 1994, and what was going through your heart and mind at that time?
A lot of things. I think for me it was, I experienced it at a distance and with the opportunity to vote abroad as exilees at the time. I think many of us were still pondering over the meaning of freedom versus the meaning of democracy. And that's a binary that many of us are still facing today and reflecting on. And whether voting in and of itself and constitutionalism is really a sufficient measure of black people's humanity in what should have been a South Africa that looks significantly different to the South Africa that we'd experienced before 1994, since the onset, of course, of the invasion of 1652. So a very odd time, and of course always a time to reflect on what it means to be an African person, what it means for us as South Africans to be among the community of other Africans, particularly given some of the hostilities towards our neighboring countries and so on and so forth. So it's a very complicated, reflective time.
I'm going to start with a few personal questions because I think sometimes they can be quite telling. So you were in exile at the time, as many people were. You voted and you were going to come home soon. And I just wonder, what were your hopes? What were you hoping to find when you got home and would eventually unfold?
So I must declare I did not vote because I actually thought that it wasn't, what I was seeing was not a reflection of what many people, my parents and others, had been exiled for. Even then. And I'm still, even today, incredibly ambiguous and ambivalent about that. What was I hoping to see? I think I was hoping to see a South Africa that looked like an African country, behaved like an African country in terms of our black people in this country having ownership, having voice in the economy, in social issues, in social development, and social transformation. And what it seems is that I think we've tried too hard to become a replica of a liberal democracy, and a liberal democracy that doesn't necessarily speak to and articulate the deepest needs of the people in this country who are still suffering, who are still marginalized, who are still dispossessed, who are still peripheralized, so people who are still unemployed, landless, unemployable, and who are still structurally poor. So structural poverty and structural inequality means it's got nothing to do with your circumstances of birth. It is an inherited legacy.
All right, so I remember Nelson Mandela speaking unity, reconciliation. I remember watching the TRC, and we all hoped that this would be a significant step in the healing process. So there was a lot of hope in the processes that were played out, and the right things were said. We won the Rugby World Cup, and all of these feelings were pointing to a changing South Africa. 25 years on, did we fall off the train somewhere along the line, or were we too optimistic at that time?
Or were we ever on the correct train?
Yeah.
So, I think those symbols, winning the soccer, winning the rugby and all of that, those were exactly symbols which really were quite distracting from the substantive issues and the issues which we're still contending with today. So issues of social redistribution, economic redistribution, and the fees must fall movement indicates to a great extent that there's a generation of young people, born free, supposedly born free, who obviously are not experiencing the tangible benefits of a post-colonial South Africa. And certainly the sort of South Africa that we need to see is one that is less apologetic about trying to appease really minority interests. And the TRC was a starting point perhaps, but we should have gone much further. So truth and reconciliation, and I've written and spoken about this before, reconciling what? Because frankly, the terms of engagement between African people and white people in this country were never harmonious. I mean, it was always a relationship between a settler and the ones who were invaded, the invader and the invaded. It was never a peaceful, joyous collaboration or a peaceful, joyous meeting. And South Africa has gotten branded into this false rainbow, this kind of false unity, false cohesion. And I'd like to almost insist that our colonial question wasn't per se that different to many others. It's not that different to Zambia or Nigeria or Ghana. The difference is, of course, the proximity of the past physically with the people who were the oppressors still living with us. And that's probably caused a lot of confusion and caused too many compromises and too many concessions.
I mean, it's a slightly different history, in fact, significantly so, but, and I know that you've spoken about this before. At the same time that Nelson Mandela was being inaugurated president, a genocide was happening in Rwanda. And these two countries, Rwanda and South Africa, have gone on different trajectories. And many would say that we had a better starting point getting into a new era than Rwanda did. What could we have done better? Lessons learned from the Rwanda story?
So the one is, I think that there was a greater, and I say this with caution because even among many Rwandese, there's a sense of disquiet and dis-ease in the way that narrative, that really raw binary of it being a Hutu and Tutsi issue. But the one thing I think is at least honest conversations, and those community courts, the Chachage courts, which were national, very similar to, I suppose, what the TRC was aiming to do, but much more grassroots orientated, community centered, and with communities really willingly coming together and reconciling. And of course, there is a difference within their context because, you know, the people, they are all Africans, and so these are basically brothers and sisters coming together and saying, look, we wronged you, or communities saying that we were wronged, and agreeing that they're going to either put it behind in the interest of a new slate, a new future, a new sense of community. The other thing, of course, that Rwanda has done very well, notwithstanding what some might argue are President Kagame's very authoritarian tendencies, is to really build a national identity, a new identity, and to engineer it very quickly, you know. So you have these days of action, these days of community where people come together to clean and to cleanse. And I see this as a kind of symbolic of an ongoing cleansing and an ongoing peace building and bridge building process, which South Africa really hasn't done in a truthful way, because obviously the patterns of the economy and the patterns of privilege in this country are still very similar to the way they were before 1994, which begs the question for many people on the ground, many African people in rural areas and peri-urban areas, of what's the point of a constitution if I'm still just as poor as I was, if I'm still unemployed, if my children still cannot afford, I still can't afford to send my children to university or to the schools of their choice, if I still have access to incredibly poor healthcare. What is the point of a constitution that isn't alive as a document, that isn't alive in my personal circumstances? And that distance between what is written and what is lived is probably the hugest gap that we still have.
All right, so what do you say to people who say, you know, those that don't understand where we've come from and why we should be celebrating today and not being miserable? How do you reconcile the two? Because, you know, I spoke to a woman a short while ago who was arrested in 1993 and spent 3 months here because she was holding the hand of a white man in 1983. And fast forward to now, and it's incredible that the country that we live in. How do we reconcile some of the things that you're mentioning and remembering where we've come from?
So one of the things that's certainly different is the sense in which socially the spaces and the places that black people are located are more enhanced, they are broadened, they are opened. And we need to be very careful to take advantage of those spaces in order to make sure that going forward, we're able to narrow that gap between the lived lives, the lived realities of many people, and the constitutional promises and premises that were promised. The Bill of Rights and all of the right to health, the right to education. There's a huge gap between them, and I think that what we have now is the space politically and socially to begin to leverage and create certainly a country that is truly liberated, and in which in years to come, more people that look like us will be able to have the kind of lives that so many people previously died for, sacrificed for, were imprisoned for in places like this.
You know, we've got so much to talk about and discuss, and I'm glad that you're going to be with us throughout the rest of the program, and we'll unpack particularly areas like economics, politics, and so on and so forth that I know that you look at often. So we'll leave that there for the time being. We'll go back to studio, but we'll be back exploring 25 years of democracy through different lenses: politics, economics. We've had a chat about education. We'll talk about human rights, equality, and issues like that. Stay with us for those all-important conversations as we look back at 25 years of democracy on Freedom Day.